Before I call the Honourable Sally Talbot, order of the day number 1 is the address and reply, and this will be the Honourable Member's inaugural speech, so the usual courtesies according to the customs of the House apply. The Honourable Sally Talbot.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I rise to introduce myself to the House, I must start by congratulating you, Mr. President, on your election. You and I both inherit a bar set very high. John Cowdell will be a hard act to follow, both as President and as Member for the South West region. John's represented the diversity of interests in Peel, the South West and the Great Southern with the dedication and skill those communities now rightly expect from their MLC. He's also, of course, been a fine President for the last 4 years. Many of the changes he's made around this place will be a lasting tribute to the first Labour parliamentarian to hold that office. There's one big difference between us, though, Mr. President. Your experience and your proven ease with the customs and practices of this place lend all your actions an authority which make you a fitting successor to John. I still have to find my place in the scheme of things, but I know I can look to you for help and advice in making my way in this new world. There are lots of different traditions and expectations relating to first speeches by new members of Parliament. Historically, some chambers have expected new members to sit quietly for years as a mark of respect to their elders and betters. Others prefer that new members wait to speak until they can address a piece of legislation that particularly interests them. Within the living memory of this chamber, new members were rostered to speak on whatever matter came up on the notice paper, which led to one unfortunate person having to frame his first speech in terms of the onion bill. Our modern tradition, however, is to allow new MPs some leeway to introduce themselves to the Parliament and to the community of Western Australia. So that the idea in a first speech is to describe a moment that's both a summary of your life experience so far that leads you to take a seat in this House, and a kind of launching pad for the agendas we want to pursue now that we're here. I'm sure I'm neither the first nor the last new member to find that life doesn't condense quite as neatly as we thought into this kind of story. So what I want to do tonight is link the why am I here question about agendas with an account of where I've come from and what it is I've pieced together along the way that I can bring before you today. In one sense, the where have I come from question has a very straightforward answer. I was born into a Labour Party family. My 2 grandfathers were shop stewards in their respective unions. One was a toolmaker and the other was the father of the chapel in the print union. My parents were active members of the British Labour Party before becoming virtually the only members of the British Labour Party when my family moved to the second safest Conservative electorate in the whole of Britain. From my earliest memories, our kitchen was campaign headquarters at every national and local election. My mother was the candidate, my grandfather was the campaign director, and my father was the campaign manager. My 3 brothers and I made up the rest of the campaign team. As soon as we could write, we were sat down at the kitchen table in a production line of folding, stuffing and addressing envelopes, while weekends were spent tramping round the district's letterboxes. My brothers and I learnt to watch Mum's face as she appeared on the town hall steps after the count. The 4 of us and our little band of supporters solemn amongst the cheering Tories. One day she came out beaming all over her face. We were sure that she'd won the seat. In fact, what we celebrated was the first time Labour had not lost its deposit in a general election. I started to find my own feet in the Labour movement when I was 16 and left school to go to the Royal College of Music in London. I got a letter from the Education Department congratulating me on getting a place at the college. The letter went on to note that I was too young to qualify for any financial assistance with my studies. And it was the Musicians' Union who came to my rescue when they not only gave me a study grant, but also made sure I got work playing in the local pier and seaside bands to help ends meet. Thinking back, a 16-year-old cellist who had no idea how to busk a bass line to the waltz from the Merry Widow was probably not high on their list of priorities, but I experienced my first taste of professional comradeship on these gigs, and I'll be forever grateful for that. I spent about 15 years working as a musician, both in the UK and in Australia, before getting my first chance to work directly in politics. I was already studying at university when in 1983, the ALP won both the state and the federal elections within 2 weeks, and I was offered a chance to go on the staff of a federal member of parliament. As many of you will remember, they were momentous years to have been involved with the ALP federally, years during which Australia came of age economically, culturally and socially. There are still contested accounts of the economic legacy of that decade. Perhaps our economic coming of age should have been tempered with a more realistic appreciation of what it's actually like to be one of the cogs in the deregulated wheel. Culturally and socially, however, there can be no ambivalence about measures like the Accord, Medicare, the Sex Discrimination Act. These reforms, along with many others, put a spring into the steps of Australians who wanted to see their society become more inclusive, fairer and more tolerant. I can't lay claim to any direct role in implementing these measures, but there was great satisfaction in helping to keep our ships in Canning and Brand on the right course for the 7 years I was part of those teams. It was during this time, and more recently working with Kim Beazley, that I got to know many of the communities in the southwest region I now represent. Mandurah, Murray and Collie were all part of the electorate held first by Wendy Phaeton and then by Kim Beazley. We worked hard to help those communities thrive and prosper, and I'm very proud now to be part of a government that's committed to delivering first-rate services to the people of the southwest. I should mention at this point that the recent election of Paddy Creevy and David Smith as the mayors respectively of Mandurah and Bunbury opens up very exciting prospects for those communities, and I look forward to working with both David and Paddy to ensure we keep moving ahead in the most constructive way possible. My next venture took me onto the staff of Murdoch University, a path well trodden before me by certain other Labor figures in this town, where I spent the time teaching philosophy and wearing a T-shirt saying, "Please do not ask me about my thesis." Eventually the thesis turned itself into a book, and I'm here to tell you tonight that owning up to having published something called Partial Reason, Critical and Constructive Transformations of Ethics and Epistemology is a great conversation killer, especially when you then have to admit to being a politician. The most recent part of my own history is the only part recognised by those in the media who like to accuse the ALP of drawing on a narrow skills base to fill these benches. Then, as now, following in John Cowdell's footsteps, I was elected as Assistant State Secretary of the WA branch of the ALP in July 2001. My last 4 years, in common with everyone else on this side of the House, has been spent working for the re-election of the Gallop Labor government. There can be no doubt that this government deserves its second term. This is only partly because of the fact that, as we heard in His Excellency's speech, we delivered the essential services that governments are elected to deliver. The police, teachers, nurses, schools and hospitals that provide the levels of safety and excellence in our health and education systems that our community deserves and expects. But it's also because we delivered in our first term a program of social reforms that overturned some of the divisive, exclusionist practices that only Labor governments seem prepared to address. One of the most significant of these was undoubtedly the gay and lesbian law reform, legislation which went a long way towards dismantling some of the prejudice and misunderstanding that destroys families and lives when left unchecked. I look forward to being part of the Labor team in the 37th Parliament as we continue to work to make our community a place where fairness is not reserved for those who are members of majority groups. So, Mr. President, that's basically the story of where I've come from. When it comes to the question of why I'm here, I guess I end up drawing on every aspect of my life experience so far to distill my answer. Once again, I find that things are not quite as readily condensable as one might expect. Reading the first speeches of some other members of this House, I feel quite envious of those whose professional experience and skills translates directly into a set of legislative priorities. I have a feeling that if I start to talk about politics in terms of Plato and Aristotle, or even Bach and Beethoven, some members will find the solitaire on their laptops irresistible. Let me instead talk about why I think it can be constructive to approach the subject of agendas in a rather broader way than is sometimes expected. It's a fact generally recognised amongst progressive social philosophers that we live in an age of uncertainty. The last decades have seen the collapse of old ways of understanding communities and relationships, the collapse of old ways of making sense of the world, of the good society, of what it actually means to be good. Yet, as my friend Eva Cox has noted, talking about uncertainty is risky because the word itself may send a frisson of fear through people. In 1996, John Howard forecast that Australians would be relaxed and comfortable on his watch. Instead, we're captive to a toxic mixture of uncertainty and the fear it generates. It's this that gives rise to what Cox describes as the worrying social phenomena of excessive demands for order, loss of public trust, self-interest, fear of strangers, increased litigiousness, and forms of fundamentalism and terrorism. Visit any electorate office, Mr. President, and you'll hear people giving voice to this phenomenon. They feel ripped off by banks, by governments, by drug companies, by the providers of everything from phones to roof cladding. They're inundated by accounts of corporate greed and mismanagement and horror stories about child abuse and pollution of our air and water. I remember listening to Talkback Radio in September 2001. Australians had already been shaken to the core by the collapse of Ansett when the World Trade Centre attacks happened. A young woman who'd just lost her job as an Ansett employee rang the radio station sobbing. "Nothing's safe anymore," she wept, and everyone listening to her knew what she meant. It's as if there was an old world order that said these things couldn't happen, that there were still jobs that were jobs for life, that ordinary people could avoid direct encounters with terrorists. So the question is, Mr. President, how can parliaments and governments respond to this changed world? How can we, as community leaders, help people make sense of our world? I think there are at least three things we can do. First, we can make sure that we colour all our deliberations with real people. We need to make sure that when we talk of progress, of reform, we know how to measure that progress in terms of the people whose lives progress affects. When reform factors out real people, it plays into that preoccupation with self-interest that I talked about just now. Self-interest is the very opposite of the collective action at the heart of the labour movement. Now, perhaps more than ever before, politics needs to be about promoting the kind of social cohesion that increases people's feeling of security. We need collective action for the common good. If we're going to provide effective representation for the real people who elect us to this place, we have to resist policies that promote fear and fuel uncertainty. It's fear and uncertainty that undermine collective action and destroy people's faith that there might be a common good worth searching for. I'm not alone in noting that certain so-called reforms being talked about in the national parliament risk increasing the levels of uncertainty and distrust in our community. How does giving employers unrestricted rights to fire employees lessen people's uncertainty and fear? How does gutting the award system, abolishing the national wage case and reducing workers' rights to bargain effectively over wages, entitlements and working conditions add to people's sense of security? Surely laws like these risk making life worse for working families. When political leaders lose sight of the real people they're leading, we all end up poorer in spirit. It doesn't have to be this way, Mr. President. The union movement has not lost sight of the real people it represents. In the face of threats like this, Labor governments should be using every resource we can muster to help people restore their trust in themselves, their relationships and their world. This leads me directly to the second thing I think we can do to respond to our changed world. It's about turning threats into opportunities. In earlier times, in a simpler, more certain world, it was not so hard to map out what constituted progress or to measure the effects of reforms. Take some of the great social reform agendas of the 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, 3 momentous legal reforms relating to women meant that we were granted property rights in 1883, equal access to education from the end of the Victorian era, and in Australia the right to vote from 1894. I'm not saying that any of these measures were uncontroversial, of course. We all know what a road to ruin we risked by giving women the vote. As for the right to an equal education, a group of medical doctors during Victorian times were reflecting not only popular but royal opinion when they issued the following advice. If women have access to education, which includes studying science and maths instead of needlework, it will inhibit lactation, cause atrophy of the uterus, produce infertility and bring on nervous breakdowns. These are not opinions likely to avoid controversy, Mr. President, but my point is that in those days it was easier to identify what shape reform had to take and how progress could be measured. The question about what reforms matter now is less easy to answer. The great social reforms in the past, like those I've just mentioned, came about because of sustained collective action, and sorting out the threats from the opportunities was fairly straightforward. Sadly, too many agendas on the non-Labor side of politics promote self-interest and destroy the spirit of collective action that sustains us on the left of the political spectrum. This means that the challenge for progressive politics is to help people see that some of the things that appear to be threats might be transformed into opportunities by changes of focus or emphasis. For example, globalisation is seen as one of the biggest threats to local community identity. Yet the globalisation of our communications technologies means that people power exists on a scale never dreamt of in previous times. Systems that can transmit millions of computer viruses an hour can also rally thousands of people to a cause in that time. Corporations which have acted behind literally closed doors now have their dealings on virtual display 24 hours a day. Debates on the morality of corporate practices fill talkback radio shows and newspaper letters pages. It's often said that Paul Keating taught the community to talk economics. Perhaps it's also true that the age of uncertainty is teaching the community to talk ethics. Moving beyond self-interest means learning who can be trusted. It's a debate every community leader, including everyone in this chamber, needs to be part of. And that brings me to my third and final point about what I think we can do in this Parliament to help people make sense of the changing world. It's the novelist Ian McEwan who says a good society is one that makes sense of being good. In other words, we're good when it makes sense. Clearly, for many people in our community, the world has stopped making sense. What used to make sense has been replaced by that toxic mixture of fear and uncertainty I talked about earlier. It's perhaps a natural reaction for people to try to reintroduce a sense of meaning in public life by emphasising things like family values and using so-called educative laws to enforce certain community standards. Instead of using the law to protect people, we want laws to control people's behaviour. In Hugh Mackay's terms, we try to force people to behave in ways that were once considered the province of personal morality. That might be an understandable reaction to what I'm calling the age of uncertainty, Mr. President, but I think it's a misuse of the power that resides in the parliamentary system. It seems to me that there are two ways we can use the power that's accorded to us as members of Parliament. We can use that power to force people to be obedient. We can regulate to bring about a climate of suspicion. We can send people back behind the barricades of self-interest by withdrawing the basic infrastructure that helps people make sense of their lives, affordable education and health services, job security, and a decent level of support for people whose circumstances put them at a disadvantage. That's the assumption we've often seen operating on the non-Labour side of politics, Mr. President, and it's to be hoped that we don't reap the full destructive force of that approach as they take control of both chambers of the Commonwealth Parliament. But it's been state Labour governments, both here and around the country, who've shown that there's another way to use the power that's given to us. It will always be my objective, and I know it's an objective shared by my colleagues on this side of the House, to use whatever power I have to help people without power. Empowering people isn't about forcing obedience or pretending we can regulate for human decency and care. It's about keeping the practices of government open and transparent. It's about helping people have the courage to make choices about the sort of life they want to live. It's about building relationships of trust and cooperation, where might does not necessarily make right, and where freedom and fairness are not distant ideals, but the web from which we weave the fabric of our public and our private lives together. Mr. President, these are the thoughts that emerge from a life spent immersed in politics, playing the cello and writing philosophy. There's one common thread that occurs to me at this point. You, more than anyone in this chamber, Mr. President, know that as parliamentarians we have to work long and we have to work hard to get it right. In the same way, a musician or a philosopher has to work with an intense degree of application to achieve an effect that may be almost undetectable to the uninitiated. This takes an unshakable commitment, but one that's sustained by understanding how very great, even momentous, the effect of such application might turn out to be. As a musician and a philosopher, I've had the immense privilege of playing passages of music and explaining complex ideas in ways that made people feel their lives were richer. I know that it's possible to make a difference to people's lives by our work in this place, Mr. President, and my commitment to make that happen is as strong now as it ever was to play the Elgar Cello Concerto or deconstruct the categorical imperative. I want to close my first speech to this House tonight, Mr. President, by acknowledging some of the people who've made a difference to my life. I've already talked about the challenges involved in following in John Cowdell's footsteps. I owe John a great deal. He's been my mentor, my teacher, and my friend for nearly 25 years. That has been a great privilege. He really didn't have to bequeath 12 years of bound Hansards to the walls of my new office to make sure I don't forget him as he moves into his new life. My friend Nan Plummer has never stopped making me feel I was good enough to try anything. As a local director of music, she gave me my first promotion as a young cellist when she put me on the front desk at the Christmas Carol concert. She is my internal voice of encouragement and support to this day, and lights up my life with true friendship, even though we live on opposite sides of the world. Without Dr. Patsy Hallen, I might not have ended up in this place. At a particular crossroads, about 20 years ago, she was the one who reminded me that there are people in politics who care as much about changing the world as the social reformers in universities. She was right about that, as well as about so many other things. Patsy lived what she taught, and my life would have been infinitely poorer without her. State Secretary of the AMWU, Jock Ferguson, has not only been a tower of strength during my 4 years at party office, he's also shown me how to juggle dozens of competing demands while never losing sight of the need to make life better for working people. Jock is one of those leaders who inspire both respect and affection, and it's a privilege to work with him. To the people of the South West who've supported me personally and politically over the years, I owe special thanks. Ilya and Susan Sennen, Enid and Ian Conakey, and Ursula and Will Richards in Denmark and Albany, Greg White, Roy Scaife, and David and Treslin Smith in Bunbury, Paddy Creevy, Lynn Rogers, and John Hughes in Mandurah are just a few of the people who've made the South West feel like home over the last 20 years. There are so many more people who, in giving me their friendship, have given me more than I can ever adequately thank them for. Amongst them are Jill Lowe, who constantly strips me of any airs and graces I try to acquire; John Ford, whose passion for politics means we never run out of things to talk about; and Margaret Duff, who knows she'll never truly be a former staffer. My parents have been a constant source of loving support and encouragement. It's a joy to have them here tonight, but I won't say too much or Dad will cry. To Wendy Phaeton and David Talbot, I just want to say that I will always hold you closest to my heart. I hope you'll continue to be as tolerant as you've been in the past, when I forget to demonstrate that to you every day. Thank you, Mr. President.